welcome. Thank you for joining us. Great stuff ahead. In his time, Heraclitus was known as the riddler. He spent as little time as possible with the people of the city, but periodically he would come into the city, and when he came into the city, he would present obscure, baffling statements that some people dismissed completely out of hand, others took the time to reflect upon, and when they did so, they uncovered something quite special. His work was indeed baffling, and in part this is because he wrote in an aphoristic manner. Aphoristically means you sort of, you could read Heraclitus front to back, back to front. Doesn't really matter the order. Not only does he use aphorisms, he's also famous for presenting all of his ideas by way of paradox. Para is to go against, doxa is the common view. So what we have of Heraclitus are his fragments. So we don't actually have the complete works. Part of this is because we're talking over 2,500 years ago. So here's an example of one of the things that he said in the fragments. Remember, he's the baffler. Here it comes. Mortals are immortals. Immortals are mortals, living their death, dying their life. Just imagine some guy not from the city rolling in and then dropping that one on your face. What are you to do with this person? No wonder they called him the obscure and the riddler. So he doesn't explain it either. He just drops it and then walks away. If I have Arthas' suggestion correct, it's not instructional, it's descriptive. Human beings use their energy in a way that tries to produce an immortal thing. And what Emma is saying is that the immortal thing is an idea that's passed to the next generation, who are mortal, who are destined to die, but the ideas live on, is the claim. Ironically, the immortal ideas live on through the mortal things. By reflecting on these paradoxes, what you're doing is you're producing a kind of friction or a tension in your own mind. And the claim is that through this friction comes the fire. He's not offering a system or a blueprint for how to organize society or anything like that at all. One immediate problem with thinking about Heraclitus is where to begin, because he's not offering a system. All we have is fragments. They're presented in the way of a paradox. How to start? While we don't know the order of his aphorisms to this day, we do know the opening line, and I've written it on the board there. For the purpose of the recording, let me read this out. And again, we have to read slowly, carefully, and think, what is he on about here? So let me put this in the background, because that's what we're talking about. Of the Logos, which is thus always, uncomprehending are humans, both before they have heard it and when they first hear it. So he starts in a very weird way, basically saying, what I'm about to explain to you, you're unaware of. And after I explain it to you, you will still be unaware of it. Begging the question, why bother even saying anything? For whatever reason, he feels compelled to try to explain it, even though he knows, no matter what he does, it's not going to be understood. So something within him, you could argue, requires that he express logos. But he knows before he's even set off on the journey that it's not going to connect to the audience, is his suggestion. So let's see if we can find a basis for a connection. When we say logos, you could think, and Heraclitus has a tendency to express, that by logos he means the divine ordering principle of the cosmos. Another way of thinking about logos, which he also uses throughout the aphorisms, is that logos means, or refers to rather, human reason itself. Logos also refers to the product of human reason. You could think of the product of human reason as language itself. So logos could also be a reference to the written word or language. Logos is always and forever of a certain kind, and humans will never be able to comprehend it. So not everybody is going to read on after they hear this statement. Maybe he's doing it in order to find a particular group of people who are receptive to the message. So that's just the opening line of the text. Hey, we're barely a sentence into the fragments. And you see how much can be gleaned from this. Heraclitus famously claims that everything is always moving, always changing, and always flowing. If that's true, if all of us are constantly changing things, and we know on a molecular level that that's true, Arthas can give us a story about it, most likely. That means that your perspective on the cosmos is also always changing. So if you're constantly changing, the way you see the world, the way you see the cosmos also is changing. And things become quite tricky, because how can you ever know what the cosmos is when the you is never a permanent thing? So when you say constantly changing, you might be wondering, what's the rate at which the change occurs? He doesn't answer this question, of course. Is there an element of stability within this change? And you see why logos, one of the meanings has to do with language. Because maybe you die, not maybe, all of us will die, but the ideas that we hatch, that we preserve in language, live on. And arguably, that's the kind of stability that's possible. So maybe logos, when referring to language, it's a reference to the organizing principle of the cosmos, but it's also a reference to language in itself, arguably, because it's the only thing that's more or less stable. But the suggestion is, everything has changed. This has a massive impact on the way in which you think about your identity as a human being. How do you see yourself? If everything is constantly changing, and the only thing that has some sort of stability is language, what does that mean for you and how you see yourself? Do you see it? So when you think about the river, right? You never step in the same river twice. We call it the same river. So in language, we use the word river. Was that the same when I say Emma? Are you like that river? That's you, but not you. Because at every moment in time, you're a slightly different thing. And yet we call you by a certain name. This concept of flux and of change, which impacts on your personal identity, also has ethical implications for our human life and our identity. For example, Brandon, let's say you're about to get married. And on this very special day, you make a promise. Brandon, you say, I will love and cherish this woman until the day that I die. And she says the same about you. Beautiful. Here's the question. If everything is flux, right, and you're always changing, how much power does that promise have? You see the impact of this immediately, right? If everything is flux, now this is the suggestion. We can't escape that fact. Everything is change. And we're desperately trying to hold on to some sort of unifying, organizing force. But the universe is pulling us apart constantly. We use language, we have culture, we have traditions. They're all just attempts to hold what is constantly separating, changing, creating, and dying. What? Yes, exactly. How long? To what extent does this promise hold? Saying the promise is held by virtue of the capacity for memory, or no? Let's say you're awake, but you've suffered an accident, and for whatever reason you can no longer remember anything about who you are, the promises that you made. Does the promise hold? As long as he's alive, you're saying the promise holds. Is that correct?
Not that he has the mind, but he can think about things and to talk.
Mm-hmm. So that's true for him, but what about for you? So let's say you're on the other side of that, your husband's there, he can't remember anything, but are you still held by that promise? Let's say it's a sincere promise when you made it, to love and cherish until the day that you die. Now comes the question, what made the promise, right? So if the promise holds, let's say Brandon, Brendan and his sweetheart make the promise to each other, why wouldn't this promise, like, Brendan, would you be offended if your wife took another man? Maybe he was more handsome or more smart, but you're a human vegetable. Would you be offended by this? Of course you'd be offended. Okay. So this.
Your nerve cells, your nerve cells is like constantly being replaced, and like in a
Yes.
molecular level, you're different. But
Is it a promise between you and the person? Or is this promise, because the promise, of course, is witnessed,
yeah.
right? Depending on the tradition, it's witnessed by family, friends, relatives. So it's not, you don't just make the promise to the person, you make the promise to yourself, and you do it in front of a group of people. So maybe what holds the promise, part of it is shame, right?
The promise made is made like promise is made like we are going to. It's like me at that time and he at that time making promise about it. We are going to stay together.
No matter what.
But, like, shame is
You've
also-
promised it to each other. My question is, what holds that promise? Is it just the two people? Or is it more than the two people? Is it the community that holds it? You're changing, she's changing. Nothing can change that. But the promise is an attempt through culture to hold on to some sort of unity, despite logos, despite the organizing principle of the universe. Trying to push the boundaries of how far this promise goes. So let's say your sweetheart, for whatever reason, she's alive, but she can't remember you or the promise. And everyone who witnessed the promise is no longer in the picture. Let's say that they've perished. Does the promise have any hold?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
Well, you make a promise to yourself, right?
Yeah.
You also say to yourself, like, who cares about other people and this, even this person? I've made a promise to myself to do this or not to do this. So if you break the promise that you made knowingly, maybe you feel shame and that's a reason that it holds, but that's not maybe the strongest reason. And it's not even the other person. You made it to yourself, to a part that wanted to love and cherish in a sincere way. And if you break that, what does that make you? Ugh. Anyways. So the important part is when you make promises. All we have is our promises after all. When you make promises, realize who's making them, what's making them, right? If you make a promise from your deepest place, then that's a promise that can hold. But if you don't actually make a promise from your deepest place, and you make a promise based on the community or some shame reinforcement structure, that's a promise that will break because it's not really a sincere promise. So it's a question of who made the promise and how far did they reach down into themselves to make that promise. Ultimately, what can hold it the most, I think, it's not even the other person or the community for sure. I think what can hold it is the principle in itself that you believe in. So it's really how much do you believe in that principle? That can hold it. Ultimately, it'll break because you'll die, and that'll be the end of it. But for a while, you can have some kind of a unity, some sort of a structure. I don't think these are the kind of questions that many people ask of themselves in a deep way when they embark on marriage, for example, which is sad, but there it is. It's a contract, right? It's a financial security that people sort of set up for themselves. But that's so sad. I hope if you're out there watching this that you have a careful think about making those kinds of promises. Hey, it is flux. There's nothing that we can do about it. We have language, we have culture, we have attempts to hold, but ultimately it's all change. They keep the promise, but we're thinking about it, you're thinking about it too small, too subjective from the point of view of a human life. That's 100 years. Look at it from the point of view of the universe. Who cares about these 100 years? Of course you do, if you're subjectively inside of the 100-year span. And the promise means something to you. But ultimately, if you look at it for what it is, that's, I think, what he means by it'll always be uncomprehendable. At the center of flux, which is a theme in Heraclitus, is this relationship between identity and change. And that's one other reason to go into the fragments and have a careful think about the paradoxes that are offered within. What's the relationship between identity and change? not sure if you're aware of this, but the way that you see yourself, and this is true of everyone, myself included, we think of the person who you are right now. You're the final version, you think. You consistently, and humans in general, all of us, consistently underestimate how much change affects us. So who you will be in 10 years, like you think whoever that's going to be, I will persist. Whatever you are now, that will stay true. But you're only seeing the world through your subjective experience. The reality is that you actually change dramatically in those 10 years. We've talked about this theme in the past, right? So the choices that you make, the promises that you make, they start to add up and they have an impact. We acquire new knowledge, right? We get rid of old beliefs, so you are changing in this way. To what extent and in what sense are we the same person, given this fact? And really at the center of this relationship between change and identity is what obligation do you have to yourself and what obligation do you have to others? Another statement from Heraclitus: the cosmos always was, is, and shall be an ever-living fire. The suggestion is that all things are in exchange for fire. So think of the fire that's within you and the fire within that person. And in many ways, when you make that promise, you're making an exchange of that fire. Remember, this is over 2,500 years ago that he's making this claim. And you have to realize what fire meant back then. This was everything. It was life, it was death, it was war, it was food. Everything was enabled by fire. We call it fire in language, but it's never the same thing. Is it a metaphor? This is the question. Fire. Yeah. It's always fluttering and moving. It creates and destroys. It always transforms. It's different depending on your perspective. Fire. So it's quite a beautiful symbol. And in many ways, when you think logos, think fire. Most importantly, fire is created through friction. So this is kind of it's a delicate idea, it's a beautiful idea. Think about it this way. When you experience a paradox and you feel the friction in your mind, the claim is that you carry within you the divine spark of the universe. It's in there. So as you're struggling through the paradox, what you're doing is, through friction, you're kind of building a little bit of an ember within you. And all you do is exchange these embers with one another. That's the game, says Heraclitus. All things are an exchange of fire. So what about this feature which we've already discussed, looking at logos not in terms of the divine spark of the universe, not in terms of reason, but the products of reason? What if it's language itself? So that's one way of translating logos, is language. It's the central feature of the opening lines, of course, of the logos, which is thus always uncomprehending, or humans both before they have heard it and when they first hear it. If everything is always in flux, including identities, can language ever really capture anything? This is the question. What can language really grasp if all is change and all people using it are changing? What can it grasp? You may recall our discussion of Wittgenstein, right? Who was very interested in the philosophy of language. In the end, it's a choice that you make in terms of how you see language. We know from the ancients that there is a very famous distinction between Socrates and Plato. Everything we know about Socrates comes from Plato, because Socrates never wrote anything down. The truth is, I think, that he had a very sophisticated outlook towards language. He was able to read. There's evidence of this, because he does ask for certain references in specific. So he wants to look to make sure that there's a certain reference. We know from his life that there's moments where this occurs. Anyways, Socrates never wrote anything down. And you could argue precisely because if he had written something down, you risk someone picking it up and thinking, here's the truth of Socrates. So he makes a commitment to truth, to the pursuit of truth. And in that pursuit, he refuses to write anything down. So that's a way of thinking about language. Plato, of course, famously writes a whole bunch of stuff. But he writes it in a dialogue. So it's, it's never quite certain. You're invited when you pick up the book, Plato's Republic, which we will do later on. Not today, of course, like in the later terms. When you pick up the book, it's an invitation to participate in the dialogue. So he's writing, but not in a way that's ideological, right? In a way where you pick it up and you think you've got the truth. In both cases, we're asking the question, to what extent can language capture anything? Socrates basically was okay with living his life this way, speaking, not actually writing. Because if he did, there would be a risk of misinterpretation. All sorts of nasty things could occur. That's how human beings treat language, sadly, as groups. Plato is a bit more sneaky. He wants to capture some of the beauty, right? Some of the gems that they've uncovered, but he wants to present it in a way that avoids the ideological risks as well. Think of how sloppy we are about ideology today. I mean, my goodness. The free market, the free market, the free market, the free market, it must be right. Wait a minute. Who's even thinking about whether it is or it isn't? Of course we are, as we should be in this moment of transition, because everything has changed after all. Heraclitus told us. And this is my famous argument against tattoos. The moment you write something down, it starts to lose truth value. One reason not to get a tattoo. It may mean something to you in the moment. Maybe you think it's important to you. But the moment that you put it onto your body, it loses truth value a little bit for yourself. I know that tattoo culture is a popular thing at the moment, but remember Plato. Yeah.
Like, I feel like tattoo reminds you of who you are, who you used to be. Isn't that right?
Yeah, who you used to be, but everything has changed, right? And who you used to be in a certain way. Does it really matter? I'm not sure.
We always attempt to grab something that is.
I don't think most people getting a tattoo, sorry to cut you off, I don't think most people getting a tattoo are thinking about it in this way. I'm convinced that that's true. Maybe if you have some sort of a deep reflective moment, it's possible, but I think even then, that's quite a subjective point of view on the universe, is my opinion. So, anyways, we're talking about logos as language. What can really be captured within it? How much can we really know through language? So, what knowledge can be gleaned from this? Remember, knowledge is another way of saying the products of reason, right? So you could argue that knowledge is an expression of logos. Should we cling to language since it's the only thing we have that can bring order? That's the question. So if the goal is to unify things, to bring order to things that are chaotic and constantly in flux, what are the elements that can bring that order? Well, arguably language is one of the things that can bring some sort of semblance of order in this universe. But we have to be careful with it, right? Because if we think that it's brought the perfect order, now we're in the domain of ideology. And that can lead, always leads to the same violent, bloody conclusions. Because one person agrees, the other person disagrees, and ultimately they're willing to die for their opinion. It can capture something, but the something is fleeting. Language, that is. You know, in some ways it has to do again with that promise that we're talking about. It's the promise is different than written language, right? Like you have the marriage contract. What can that show? Well, it shows something. It shows it's a document that something happened. But when the marriage contract burns in the fire, does the marriage end? No. Clearly the marriage is not just symbolized in language or even in words. If you've ever really loved somebody, you know that this is true, that there isn't a word for it. You can't really say it. It's not strong enough. You have to show it. Even then, it's never quite complete. If you had this experience, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Language has very serious limits. What can we know through language? As it turns out, not very much at all. In part because we're always changing and the world is changing around us. So we have these pathetic attempts to capture it. And when we do, we think we have order. And consistently, we overvalue the things that are written. which is a problem, and you have to be aware of this. Now comes the question, what are you going to do about it, in the sense that what will your relation to language be? And I'm suggesting that you're very careful and conscious in how you relate to language. We have to be much more thoughtful about the way that we think about words, the way that we use words, and how we relate to language itself. It's not truth, hey, at all. It's just an attempt to say something about the world, which is fleeting and changing. So how can you really take it that seriously? China as a society is organized around a small set of books. Think about it. It's a little bit insane, given ancient Chinese philosophy, right? But people forget this. Anyways, so forget about the world. What can you do about it? Well, you can start thinking about language a little differently and relate to language a little differently. In the case of Socrates, he didn't want to touch it. In the case of Plato, he touched it in a very poetic way. He's an equivocator, Plato. Yeah?
But, like, the ideology is like the product of like language, of like what we want to keep unchanged, right?
Yeah.
And if we don't have it, does it mean like the world, because the world actually, it doesn't have an order. Like if we don't have ideology, like, will the world be?
Well, I don't think there's anything wrong with an attempt to bring order to the chaotic, changing world around us. There's nothing wrong with that as a project. I think that's, in many ways, we have to try to bring order to things using our faculty of reason, the divine spark, right? So you're going to look out into the world, you see the paradoxes, the friction starts in your mind, right? You're going to express what you see in language, but whatever it is that you produce, the moment you've written it down, you've kind of it's already entombed in history. And so to carry that as though it's a universal truth that's going to bring order, that's the problem. So we should strive towards order. Now we're really in the domain of Heraclitus. We should strive towards order, looking at the paradoxes of the world. I mean, think about how much needless suffering there is in this world. I hope that friction allows the divine spark inside of you to spark up and create a little bit of a fire. Maybe that fire expresses itself, that logos expresses itself in a sort of a written text. But don't overestimate the value of that written text. It's just an attempt to know. I think the problems we have, and I'm not saying don't try to bring order to things, I'm saying the problems we have is too much of a thoughtless, unconscious approach to language, expressed in a big way in ideology. And now, more than ever, we have to be thinking very carefully about how we do this.
The problem is that as long as we write it down, like, it becomes something not the truth. So like.
You see why Socrates never wrote anything, because he knew if I write it, and it takes off, it will be used in a stupid way. Like, you could almost guarantee that it will be used in a stupid way. And hence his idea, I don't even want to touch it. That's a certain relation to language. I'm not prescribing that you become Socrates, although there's worse things in life. But what I'm saying is you have to be thoughtful about how you relate to language itself, because it can get dangerous. Yeah.
But there is like intrinsic problem in language. No matter how careful we are, as long as we write it down, like it's like becomes not the truth. And also like nowadays, if we do not want to have an ideology, we still need to like write something down to like bring the world together and to like.
You can control how you write it down. I mean, Heraclitus is another example. So Socrates never touched it. Heraclitus, the pre-Socratic, presents everything in paradox, right? So that's one way of using language in a safe way. And history has very famous examples of what happens when you don't use language carefully. One of the most important ones, which may or may not connect to you at all, if you don't know the history of this, it won't mean much to you. But you have to realize that the Second World War happens in many ways because of a singular thinker named Martin Heidegger, who, before his affiliation with the Nazis, was considered the most brilliant philosopher on the planet. He wrote a book called Being in Time. Were it not for the connection to the Nazis, we would probably remember him as the most brilliant human being that's ever lived. His words found an audience and were used in ways that I'm certain in his deepest self, he probably didn't intend. But it was too late. It was already out into the world. He thought that he could be the philosopher king and control Hitler and use the Nazi machine to create a world for his philosophy. That was in his head, I think. But I don't think he understood what he was doing. And he grossly overestimated his ability. He was actually quite a small man at the end. Of course, all of us are that way. Okay? So if you don't know the history of it, that won't mean much. If you know the history of it, that will mean quite a bit. So what I'm suggesting is there's incredible value in the work of Heraclitus, in the fragments, in the paradoxes. As we embark upon them, think of them as the fuel that creates the friction that allows the divine spark in you to create that fire. Now, when you create it, what are you going to do with it? You can speak about it, you can write about it, and you have to figure out how you're going to relate to the thing that you produce, right? The products of your reason. Does that make sense? It's a little bit strange. So I don't know what you guys are talking about in TOK, but this is Heraclitus.